The blizzard hit on the third night of January 1874. By the time the sun rose over the prickly pear valley, the temperature had fallen to 31 degrees below zero. Inside a small log cabin 15 miles west of Helena,
Almost
Montana
done. Hold
territory, a
steady.
7-year-old boy named
It's
Emmett burned
slippery,
with
but I'm
fever while
ready.
wind screamed through the
Good.
darkness
Come up
outside like something
slowly.
alive and angry.
I've got
His mother
you.
had not slept in 36 hours. She had not eaten since the previous morning, but the fire in her stove had not gone out once. At some point near dawn, she opened a door. Not the door to the outside,
Hold
not the
on
door that
tight,
led into
boys.
killing cold and whiteout
I'm
darkness,
so
but
cold,
a door to a
Ma. I
covered
know.
corridor
We'll
that wrapped
find
around the
shelter
entire
soon.
cabin like a
Stay
wooden
with me.
embrace. She stepped 3 feet. She lifted 3 split logs from a stack that stood bone-dry, and within arm's reach, protected by a roof structure, she had spent the better part of a summer building while her neighbors laughed at her. She stepped back inside. She fed the stove. She sat beside her son and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and listened to the wind try to tear the world apart. She never lost sight of him, not for a single second. 8 months earlier, every person in that valley had told her she was going to get her children killed. This is the story of why they were wrong. Clara Merritt arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1873 with 3 children, $47, and a land claim her husband had filed 2 weeks before a mine accident took his life. She was 31 years old. She had dark circles under her eyes that had been there since the funeral and showed no signs of leaving. She had calluses on her hands from work she had done before the journey and harder work she knew was coming after it. She had a 9-year-old daughter named Nora, a 6-year-old son named Emmett, and a 4-year-old son named Jasper, who still sometimes woke in the night calling for his father. She had chosen to come anyway. The homestead sat in a narrow valley where Prickly Pear Creek cut through pine-covered hills. The land was beautiful in the way that dangerous places often are, vast and still and indifferent to the small human drama unfolding across the surface. The cabin measured 16 by 20 feet with a dirt floor and a roof that leaked in 4 places and chinking gaps wide enough to see through on a bright day. The nearest neighbor, a widower named Weston Greer, lived 3/4 of a mile downstream and had the quiet, careful manner of a man who had learned not to offer opinions unless someone was bleeding. The closest town, a collection of 11 buildings called Unionville, that stood 7 miles east along a road that became impassable for weeks at a time when winter came. Clara had known it would be hard. She had not known exactly how hard, because some things cannot be understood until you are standing inside them. She spent her first month doing what needed doing. She patched the roof with split shakes, working from a ladder, while Nora handed tools up from the ground. She filled chinking gaps with moss and clay, pressing the material in with her fingers until her hands were raw. She had Emmett and Nora gather stones from the creek bed for a better hearth, and she rebuilt it herself using techniques her father had shown her years ago when she was a girl in Ohio, back when the world was smaller and safer and her husband was still alive. Jasper helped by staying close and not wandering toward the creek, which was the most useful thing a 4-year-old could contribute. And she told him so seriously, and he took the responsibility seriously. And that small exchange was the first moment in weeks that she had felt anything close to warmth that had nothing to do with a fire. By May, the cabin was livable. That was the word she used in her mind. Livable. Not comfortable, not safe, not good livable. It was a frontier word, and she was becoming a frontier woman, which meant she was becoming someone who measured success in smaller and smaller increments, until survival itself felt like an achievement worth noting. Then old man Briggs arrived, and the real education began. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, riding a horse that looked as weathered and skeptical as he did. Briggs was 63 years old and had survived 26 Montana winters, which in that valley carried the same authority as a medical degree or a military commission. He had buried 2 partners, 1 wife, and more cattle than he liked to count. He wore that history on his face the way stone wears weather, not as damage, but as character accumulated and permanent. He stopped his horse near the cabin and looked at Clara the way a man looks at something he is trying to calculate the value of. "You the widow that filed on the Whitaker claim," he said. "I'm Clara Merritt. she said. I filed on my husband's claim. Briggs nodded like there was no meaningful difference between those two statements. He told her what she needed to know. 8 cords of firewood, minimum. Each cord was a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, 8 feet long, and she would need 8 of them. Pine burned fast in this country. She would go through a cord every 3 weeks once the cold set in, and cold here meant October through April. 7 months of it, the kind of cold that did not apologize and did not wait for you to be ready. 8 cords meant cutting, splitting, and stacking the better part of 900 individual pieces of firewood, each one requiring multiple axe strokes in the kind of sustained physical effort that reduced grown men to exhaustion by the 3rd week. He looked at her. He looked at the children behind her. He looked at the cabin. A woman alone can't cut that much timber and tend children and keep a garden, he said. You'd best find yourself a husband or head back to wherever you came from before you get those kids killed. He said it the way he would have said the temperature or the distance to town. Not cruelly, just factually, as if he were reporting a condition of the landscape rather than making a judgment about her character. He tipped his hat and rode on. Clara watched him go. Then she went inside, sat at the small table by the window, took out a piece of paper, and started doing mathematics. Here is what most people in that valley did not know about Clara Merritt. Her father had run a sawmill in Ohio for 30 years. She had grown up in a world where wood was not just fuel but physics, where the difference between green timber and seasoned timber was measured not in feel or tradition, but in British thermal units, in moisture content percentages, in the mathematical relationship between what you put into a fire and what the fire gave back. She knew that a cord of pine at 20% moisture content produced approximately 14.3 million BTUs. She knew that the same cord at 40% moisture, the kind of moisture that accumulated in an outdoor woodpile exposed to rain and snow, in ground contact, produced closer to 10 million BTUs. She knew that the difference was not trivial. The difference was 30% of your heat gone to evaporation, gone to smoke, gone to nothing. Briggs had told her she needed 8 cords, and he was right if she stored wood the way everyone else stored wood. But what if she didn't? She sat with the paper for a long time. The children played outside, the creek made its sound. The pines stood still in the late afternoon light, holding their shadows close against the ground. If she could store wood at 20% moisture instead of 40, she needed only 5.5 cords to achieve the same heat output as 8. That was a difference of 2.5 cords, roughly 250 pieces of firewood, roughly 3 weeks of work. In a world where time was the scarcest resource she possessed, that difference was the difference between possible and impossible. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She did not yet know how she was going to accomplish this. She only knew that the problem was not what Briggs had told her it was. The problem was not the amount of wood. The problem was the moisture in the wood, and moisture was a problem that could be engineered around. The idea came to her in early June on a day when the sky had been clear since morning and then wasn't. She was splitting rounds near the cabin when the rain started. It began the way summer rain sometimes begins in that country, gently, then not gently at all, the sky delivering its change of mind with considerable force and very little warning. Clara grabbed the canvas she kept for exactly this purpose and ran to cover the woodpile. But by the time she got there, the split pieces on top were already soaked through. She stood in the rain with the canvas in her hands and looked at what she had done and what she could not undo, and felt the particular frustration of a setback that should have been preventable. She spent the next 2 days turning the wet wood by hand, repositioning pieces to catch the wind, checking moisture content, the way her father had taught her, by weight, by sound, by the particular resistance the wood offered when you tried to split it further. The seasoning process had been set back by at least a week. In July, that was an inconvenience. In November, it was a crisis. She moved what she could under the cabin's south-facing eave, where the extended roof offered 4 feet of protection from rain. 4 feet. She stood there and looked at it, and looked at the cabin, and something shifted in the way she was seeing the problem. The eave was 4 feet. She needed covered storage for 5.5 cords of wood. The cabin itself was 16 by 20 feet. If she extended the roof line outward by 6 feet on all four sides, she would create a covered corridor wide enough for the full 5.5 cords elevated off the ground, protected from rain and snow, open on the sides for air circulation within 10 feet of her front door. Not a woodshed separate from the cabin, not a structure she would have to walk to in a blizzard. A structure that was part of the cabin around the cabin, integrated into the cabin, the way a hat is integrated into a person wearing it. She got out the bark she used for sketching and started calculating. Posts to support the extended roof, 16 set 3 feet deep, tamped with rock for stability. Height to match the cabin walls at 8 feet. Horizontal beams to carry the rafters. Rafters cut from standing dead lodgepole pine. The forest was full of it, each one 12 feet long, spaced 16 inches apart, sloped to shed snow. The whole thing covered with split shakes. Materials cost whatever nails and hardware she couldn't produce herself paid for with the money she earned washing laundry for miners at 50 cents per load. The project would take most of the summer she would otherwise spend cutting firewood the traditional way. It was a gamble of exactly the kind that made frontier life so unforgiving. Spend your resources building a better system, and you might arrive at winter with a better system and not enough wood to fill it, or spend your resources on the old system and arrive at winter, knowing you had done your best and your best was not going to be enough. She made her decision the same way she made all her decisions in those months, by sitting with it until the fear became manageable, and then moving before it became large again. The community's response was immediate and educational. Reverend Cord was 47 years old and had established 3 churches across Montana Territory and carried himself with the patient authority of a man who believed he had been specifically assigned to correct errors in human thinking wherever he found them. He heard about Clara's plan after Sunday services in Unionville and found her before she reached her wagon. Sister Merritt, he said with the tone of someone explaining arithmetic to a child who should have learned it already. I have buried settlers who ignored proven wisdom. A woodshed belongs separate from a dwelling for very good reason. If your woodpile catches a spark, do you want it surrounding your home with your children inside? Build a proper shed 20 feet from the cabin, as everyone does, and trust in the Lord to give you strength for the walk. Clara had already worked through the fire risk calculation. An open-sided corridor she had determined would not accumulate sparks the way an enclosed structure would. The greater danger statistically was exposure. The territorial newspaper had reported that the previous winter had claimed 17 lives in the Helena area, most of them from freezing, while attempting to reach outbuildings in blizzard conditions. A woman had been found dead 15 feet from her own front door, disoriented in a whiteout. The math as Clara saw it did not favor the Reverend's position, but she did not say any of this to Reverend Cord. You cannot argue someone into belief. You can only demonstrate, and demonstration required a structure that did not yet exist. Thank you for your concern, she said, and climbed onto her wagon. Harriet Voss ran the trading post in Unionville with the sharp efficiency of a woman who had survived 2 difficult marriages and intended to survive everything else through sheer force of attention to detail. She was 52 years old, had buried both her husbands with composure, and moved on with business, and she had opinions about most subjects involving women and risk. When Clara came in for nails and hinges in late June, Harriet weighed out the 16-penny nails on her scale without looking up. I heard about your building project, she said. Folks are talking. They say you're wasting the summer on foolishness when you should be cutting wood like everyone else. She looked up. You know what happens to people who decide they're smarter than experience. They end up buying supplies on credit they can't repay. I'm currently holding title to 4 properties from people who were absolutely certain they had a better idea. It was an effective argument because it was not entirely wrong. Clara had $18 left. Failure meant exactly what Harriet described. It meant debt and foreclosure and a return to Ohio with nothing but the knowledge that she had tried something and it had not worked, and three children who would carry that history with them for the rest of their lives. Clara paid for the nails without defending her plan. Defense required proof. Proof required completion. Old Man Briggs heard the full scope of the project when he encountered Clara at Unionville 3 weeks later. He listened with the expression of a man watching someone make an expensive mistake in slow motion. "You're building a what?" he said. She described it. The extended roof, the covered corridor, the elevated stacking, the air circulation system. Briggs was quiet for a moment. "That's the shed that ate the cabin," he said. He said it with a kind of dark admiration, the way you might acknowledge an impressive piece of stupidity. It got a laugh from two men standing nearby, and the laugh spread, and by the following Sunday, the phrase had traveled to every homestead in the valley. The shed that ate the cabin. That's what they were calling it. That's what they were calling her. Clara heard about it and went back to work. She broke ground in early July. The first task was the posts, 16 of them, set in a rectangle around the cabin's perimeter, each one positioned 6 feet from the cabin walls. She sunk each post 3 feet into the ground and tamped the base with rocks for stability, checking plumb with a string and a weight she had made from a river stone, adjusting until every post stood precisely vertical. The work could only happen during Jasper's nap time and after Nora and Emmett had finished their morning chores, which meant she had perhaps 6 hours of productive construction work each day, broken into pieces. Nora was 9 years old and serious in the way that children become serious when they understand that the adults around them are managing something important. She helped dig post holes using a narrow spade and a pry bar, her thin arms working with a focus that made Clara ache somewhere behind the sternum. Emmett hauled rocks from the creek bed for tamping and occasionally handed tools up to his mother without being asked, having figured out that anticipating the next need was more useful than waiting to be told. Jasper's contribution was staying where he was put and handing nails when requested, which he did with the grave concentration of someone performing a critical duty. By mid-July, all 16 posts stood in position. A rectangle of raw timber surrounded the cabin taller than Clara's head, casting long shadows in the afternoon. Neighbors who passed on the trail to Unionville slowed their horses to look. Some shook their heads. Some just looked. Weston Greer came on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of July. He was 39 years old, had lost his wife to cholera 2 years prior, and had the careful stillness of a man who had learned that the world could change completely without warning, and that the appropriate response to this knowledge was to watch more carefully than before. He brought half a haunch of venison wrapped in canvas and stood looking at the post for a long moment before he spoke. "That's an ambitious project," he said. "I'll finish before snow," Claire said. She was lifting a horizontal beam into position and did not stop what she was doing to have the conversation. Weston watched her work. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are still determining whether what they have to say is worth the saying. Finally, he spoke. "What happens if the design works, but you run out of time to fill it?" Clara set the beam down. She looked at him. She realized the first question anyone had asked that engaged with the actual problem, rather than the surface appearance of the problem. Reverend Cord had argued tradition. Harriet Voss had argued precedent. Briggs had argued against her capabilities. Weston Greer was asking about the one genuine vulnerability in her plan, not whether the design would work, but whether she could execute it fully before winter arrived. "I have 6 weeks after the roof goes up," she said. "The elevated stacking and the air circulation will dry wood faster than traditional ground storage. I'm estimating I need 5.5 cords at full efficiency versus the 8 that Briggs quoted. That means I need to cut and stack 4 more cords in 6 weeks, which is achievable if the roof is up by the first week of September." Weston looked at her for a moment. "And if it's not, then it's not," Claire said. "And I'll have the answer to a question I'd rather know the answer to now than in January." Weston nodded. He left the venison on the chopping block and walked back down the trail toward his own place. He did not offer to help. He did not tell her she was wrong. He did not say much of anything, really. But he had asked the right question, and that was more useful than anything else anyone had offered her since she had arrived in Montana territory. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat at the table and looked at the address written on a piece of paper in her desk. Drawer, her brother in Ohio, a house with a proper roof and 4 rooms and neighbors close enough to call to. Children who would be warm in January and fed in March, and not dependent on a 31-year-old widow's calculation about British thermal units being the difference between living and dying. She held the paper for a while. She thought about what it would mean to send it. She thought about what it would mean not to. Then she folded it, put it back in the drawer, went to bed and rose before dawn to continue building. The shed that ate the cabin was not going to build itself. The roof structure consumed the entire month of August. 73 rafters cut from standing dead lodgepole pine, each one 12 feet long and 4 inches in diameter, notched to fit against the cabin's existing roof line, and the outer beams secured with the nails from Harriet Voss's trading post. 16-inch spacing. Clara cut each rafter herself, fitted each one herself, and climbed up to secure each one herself while Nora stood below, ready to hand up whatever was needed, and Emmett steadied the ladder base with both hands in the full seriousness of a 6-year-old who understood that the ladder must not move. By the final week of August, the roof was on. The covered corridor existed. It was objectively strange-looking, a small cabin at the center of a much larger roof structure, the way a chess piece sits at the center of its own shadow. From the road, it looked like a mistake, like something that had been designed by someone who did not understand how buildings were supposed to look, which was, of course, exactly what the neighbors had been saying all summer. Clara stood inside the corridor for the first time when the last shake was nailed down. It was late afternoon, and the light came in sideways through the open signs, golden and slanted, and the air moved through it the way air moves through a well-designed space, not trapped, not stagnant, but channeled and purposeful. The ground inside the corridor was dry. The ground outside was wet from a rain 2 days before. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the dirt floor inside the structure, and it was dry 6 feet from where the rain had fallen. She stood up and looked at what she had built. 3/4 of a cord of wood was already stacked inside split pieces, laid in courses with gaps between them, to allow air circulation raised off the ground on a lattice of small poles to prevent ground moisture from wicking up. She picked up a piece from the stack and then walked to the edge of the covered area and picked up a piece from the small pile she'd left outside 2 weeks ago to compare. The outside piece was heavy with moisture. The inside piece was noticeably lighter, drier further along in its seasoning. The design was working. She had 6 weeks until the first serious cold. She had 3/4 of a cord seasoning in the corridor. She needed 5.5 cords total, which meant she needed to cut, split, and stack another 4 3/4 cords before the valley froze. Old man Briggs had said a woman alone couldn't do it. Clara Merritt had never found that argument particularly interesting. What interested her was the mathematics of wood and weather and time, and the mathematics, for the first time since she had arrived in this valley, were beginning to lean in her direction. She picked up her splitting maul and went back to work. September arrived the way it always does in Montana territory, with a warmth that felt like a gift and a coldness underneath it that felt like a warning. The days were still long enough to work by natural light from 5 in the morning until nearly 8 at night. The aspens along the creek had begun their turn yellow, bleeding into the green the way a bruise develops slow and then suddenly complete. The air smelled of pine resin and dry grass, and something colder beneath both of those things, something that had no name but that every creature in the valley recognized instinctively as the approach of a season that did not negotiate. Clara recognized it too. She had not been in Montana long enough to know it the way Briggs knew it, the way Weston Greer knew it, the way the horses knew it, and the ground squirrels knew it, and the creek itself seemed to know it as it ran faster and colder in the mornings. But she was a woman who paid attention, and attention in that country was the closest thing to experience you could acquire quickly. She was cutting and splitting by first light every morning that September, working until her back spasmed and her hands stopped cooperating, then resting 20 minutes and starting again. The children worked alongside her in the ways they could. Nora had developed real skill with a draw knife stripping bark from logs with steady, confident strokes, her thin arms finding a rhythm that Clara would not have predicted in June. Emmett stacked the split pieces inside the corridor, learning by observation how to position each piece for maximum air circulation, leaving gaps alternating direction every few courses, the way his mother had shown him once, without making a lesson of it. Jasper handed nails when they were needed and fetched water from the creek and considered himself an essential member of the operation, which in small ways he was. By the end of the first week of September, Clara had 2.5 cords stacked inside the corridor. By the third week, 3 cords. The wood that had been there since August was drying faster than she had calculated the air movement through the open-sided structure, pulling moisture out with a consistency that outdoor piling could not match. She picked up pieces from the early stack and felt the difference in her hands lighter, drier the surface beginning to show the small checks that appeared in properly seasoned pine. The mathematics were holding. That was the thing she checked each evening, the way a navigator checks position, not with hope, but with the rigorous attention of someone for whom accuracy was not a preference, but a survival requirement. Doc Elmore rode out from Helena in the first week of September, making his annual circuit of the Valley homesteads before the roads became unreliable. He was 56 years old, had practiced medicine across 3 territories, and had arrived at the age and experience level where he no longer wasted time on social approach when he had something direct to say. He pulled his horse up short when he came around the bend and saw Clara's structure for the first time. He sat on his horse for a full 30 seconds without speaking. "What in God's name is that?" he said. It was not quite a question. "It's a covered wood storage corridor," Clara said. She was splitting rounds and did not stop. "Integrated into the roof line of the cabin. Keeps the wood dry and within reach of the door." Doc dismounted. He was a methodical man, and he walked around the entire structure before he said anything else, examining the posts, the rafter connections, the way the shakes shed water the open sides. He looked at the wood stacked inside. He looked at Clara. "You've got maybe 3 cords in there," he said. "You need 8 minimum, possibly 10 to be safe. It's the 4th of September. You have 6 weeks before serious, cold 8, before snow that will close you in." "I've seen this before, Mrs. Merritt. Pride takes a particular form out here. It looks like confidence right up until January." Clara set her maul down. She had been waiting for this conversation not from Doc Elmore specifically, but from someone who would make the argument in terms precise enough to be worth answering precisely. "I'm not operating on pride," she said. "I'm operating on heat efficiency calculations. Traditional ground-stacked wood loses approximately 30% of its BTU value to moisture absorbed from ground contact and precipitation. This structure eliminates ground contact entirely and prevents precipitation exposure. That means I need 30% less volume to achieve the same heat output. 8 cords at 70% efficiency equals 5.6 cords at full efficiency. I have 3 cords stacked and 6 weeks to cut 2.6 more. That's less than half a cord per week, which is achievable." Doc Elmore looked at her for a long moment. "You've calculated heat efficiency," he said. "My father ran a sawmill for 30 years. I grew up understanding BTU values and moisture content. Pine at 20% moisture produces approximately 14.3 million BTUs per cord. Pine at 40% produces approximately 10 million. The difference is not academic." Doc said nothing. He walked to the corridor entrance and picked up a split piece from the stack, a piece that had been there since early August, nearly 5 weeks. Then he walked to the edge of the covered area and picked up a piece from a small comparison pile Clara had maintained outside under canvas cut from the same tree on the same day. He held one in each hand, feeling the weight the way you feel the difference between a full canteen and an empty one. The covered piece was noticeably lighter. He set them both down carefully, the way a man sets down something that has changed the way he's thinking. The design is working, he said. It was not a question this time either. Yes. Doc was quiet for a moment. He was a man who respected evidence when evidence was presented clearly, which was perhaps the quality that had kept him practicing medicine for 30 years in places where medicine was difficult. He had adjusted his thinking before, and he adjusted it now visibly, the way a ship adjusts course, not dramatically but definitively. All right, he said, your efficiency argument is sound. The design is functioning as intended. He paused. But your mathematics don't account for catastrophic variables, Mrs. Merritt. Equipment failure, extended illness, a winter that runs longer than 7 months. He looked at her directly. Your math doesn't account for a sick child in January. The words landed in a way that other warnings had not. Reverend Cord had argued tradition. Harriet Voss had argued precedent. Briggs had argued capability. But Doc Elmore had just identified the one variable that Clara's careful calculations could not fully control, the vulnerabilities that lived not in the structure or the wood or the weather, but in the small fever-prone body of a 6-year-old boy who had been coughing intermittently since August. She held his gaze. I know, she said quietly. Doc nodded. He remounted his horse and rode on to the next homestead. He did not tell her to stop what she was doing. He did not tell her she was wrong. He left her standing in her corridor with 3 cords of drying wood and the particular weight of a risk that had just been named aloud for the first time. She stood there for a while after he left. Then she picked up her maul and went back to splitting. October came fast and stayed cold. The 18th brought the first real snow, 3 inches of heavy wet flakes that came down in the morning and melted by early afternoon, leaving the ground dark and saturated and steaming faintly in the thin sunshine. It was the kind of snow that experienced settlers called a reminder. Not the winter itself, but winter's advance notice its way of letting you know it was aware of you and would be arriving shortly. Clara added a 4th cord to her stacks that week. The total was now 4 cord against a target of 5.5. 6 weeks to the date she had estimated as the onset of serious sustained cold. The mathematics were still possible. They were no longer comfortable. She began rationing heat. At night, she let the cabin temperature drop to 55 degrees, which was cold enough that she could see her breath in the far corners of the room. She bundled Emmett and Nora and Jasper in every blanket the cabin contained and put them close together for shared warmth, a practical arrangement that Emmett complained about once and did not complain about again after Nora explained the situation to him in the quiet, direct manner she had developed for exactly these conversations. Jasper slept through the cold with a complaint being 4 years old and therefore still possessed of the adaptability that age and expectation have not yet reduced. Claire herself slept in her clothes and woke twice each night to feed the stove enough to keep the temperature from dropping below 50. She was losing weight that she could not spare. Her dresses had begun to hang differently on her frame, and the face she saw in the small mirror above the washstand in the mornings had a sharpened quality, the underlying structure becoming more visible as the surface softened. She noted these things the way she noted everything, precisely without sentiment, as data points in an ongoing assessment. She was still ahead. That was what she told herself on the mornings when the tiredness was so deep it had stopped feeling like tiredness and started feeling like a physical substance she was moving through. She was still ahead. The wood was drying, the structure was sound, the mathematics were holding. Then came the night at the end of October when she sat alone at the table with her calculations and her hands could not hold the pencil properly. The blisters had broken and healed and broken again so many times over the summer that the skin on her palms had developed a texture that was no longer quite like skin, harder, less responsive, reluctant to perform fine tasks. She sat for a long time trying to grip the pencil well enough to write, and finally managed it, and she laid out the numbers again, the way she had laid them out 100 times. 4 cords stacked, 1.5 cords needed. 5.5 weeks remaining before she had calculated the first serious sustained freeze. The numbers said she was going to make it. She sat with the numbers, and she sat with her hands, and she sat with the sound of her children breathing in the next room. And then she opened the drawer and took out the piece of paper with her brother's address in Ohio. She held it in her damaged hands and looked at it for a long time. She was not in that moment thinking about giving up. That is important to understand. She was doing something harder than giving up. She was forcing herself to look directly at the question she had been moving too fast to look at since June. The question was not whether she could do it. She believed she could do it. The question was what it would mean if she was wrong. Not for her, for Emmett, who had been coughing since August. For Nora, who had stopped being 9 years old somewhere in the middle of July and had become something older and more careful. For Jasper, who still sometimes woke in the night calling for his father. If the design failed, or if the winter ran long, or if her body gave out before the wood was cut, what then? What happened to 3 children in a 16 by 20 cabin in Montana territory in February with no heat and no way out? She sat with that question for 20 minutes. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. The night pressed against the windows with its full weight. Then she folded the paper along its original crease, put it back in the drawer, and went outside. It was nearly midnight and the stars were extraordinary. The kind of stars that only appear when the air is cold and completely dry. She could see the ridgeline clearly, the dark shapes of the pines against the blue-black of the sky and the creek glinting somewhere below in the darkness and the pale shape of her covered corridor gleaming faintly in the starlight, solid and angular and real. She picked up her maul and split wood by starlight, for an hour the sound carrying clearly in the cold air, each stroke precise and unhurried, until her shoulders loosened and her breathing steadied, and the thing she had been sitting with inside had moved into a different position. Not gone, never gone, but no longer in the center of her chest where it had been making it difficult to breathe. She went back inside. She slept 4 hours. She rose before dawn and continued. Weston Greer came in the first week of November with a wagon load of firewood. He pulled up to the quarter entrance without ceremony and climbed down from the wagon seat and began unloading without knocking on the cabin door or announcing his purpose. Clara came out when she heard the wagon and stood watching him for a moment. "I've got extra," he said, setting a split log into the quarter stack without looking at her. They both understood what this was. Nobody in the Prickly Pear Valley had extra firewood in November. Nobody cut extra wood for strangers in a country where your own survival was never guaranteed past March. What Weston Greer had was a neighbor who was close to short and children who had not done anything to deserve the consequences of arithmetic. "I'll pay you back in spring," Claire said. "Laundry or mending, whatever you need." "Nora taught my boy his letters last month," Weston said. He kept stacking without pausing. She watched him work. There was something efficient and considered about the way he moved through the corridor, placing wood the way she had shown it should be placed with gaps elevated position for air movement. He had been paying attention in July when he visited, and she had not realized it until now. He reached the middle section of the corridor and stopped. He looked at the posts. He looked at the angle of the rafters. He looked at the way the roof joinery handled the connection between the extended structure and the cabin's existing roof line. He pulled a short length of measuring cord from his coat pocket. He measured the spacing between posts. He measured the rafter pitch. He measured the depth of the corridor from post to cabin wall. He said nothing. He put the measuring cord back in his pocket and continued stacking. Clara watched him do this and understood exactly what it meant. Weston Greer was a man who expressed conviction through action rather than language. He had not said she was right in July when he asked the right question. He had not said she was right in September when the mathematics held. But he was measuring the post spacing in November with a cord he had brought with him specifically for this purpose, which meant he had known before he left his homestead that morning that he was going to be measuring something today. The most cautious man in the valley was recording her design. He finished unloading. The additional wood brought Clara's total to 4.5, or I was still half a cord short of her 5.5 or target, but close enough that the margin no longer felt like a gap and started feeling like something that could be closed. Weston climbed back onto his wagon. He gathered the reins. He sat there for a moment looking at the corridor structure from the outside, the full shape of it, the way it wrapped the cabin on all sides, the roof above it gleaming with a particular sheen of properly split and fitted shakes. "This design makes sense," he said. "I don't know why nobody thought of it before." "Because it looks strange," Clara said. "People don't trust strange even when strange works better than what they know." Weston considered this. He nodded once, which from him was the equivalent of a longer speech, and drove his wagon back down the trail. November settled in and stayed cold. Temperatures dropped to the teens at night and barely climbed above freezing during the day. And the cold was the serious kind, the kind that went through walls and found gaps and made you aware of every place where the structure between you and the outside world was less than perfect. Clara burned wood, steadily feeding the stove every 4 hours through the day, and twice in the night maintaining the cabin at a temperature that was not comfortable but was not dangerous. The convenience she had designed into the system became real in ways she had calculated but not quite felt until she was living it. She could reload the stove without putting on her coat, without pulling on her boots, without opening a door into killing, cold, and stepping out into wind and darkness. She simply opened the corridor door, stepped 3 feet to the nearest stack, lifted what she needed, and stepped back. 30 seconds. Never losing the heat of the room, never losing the knowledge of where her children were, never losing the chain of continuity that kept a household from coming apart at its edges in the deep of winter. By mid-December, she had burned through 1.5 cords. Briggs had estimated 1 cord every 3 weeks. She was running exactly at his estimate, which confirmed that her efficiency calculations were correct. The dry, well-seasoned wood from the corridor was producing more heat per piece than traditionally stored wood would have at the same volume. The mathematics were working. The system was working. And Emmett had begun to cough, not dramatically, not the kind of cough that announced itself as a crisis. Just a sound that appeared in the evenings when the temperature dropped a dry catch in the back of his throat that sometimes woke him and sometimes didn't. Clara watched it with the particular attention of a mother who has learned that the distance between a mild cough and a dangerous one can close faster than you expect in cold country. She did not say anything about it to the children. Nora noticed anyway because Nora noticed most things, and she began bringing Emmett his water without being asked and making sure he was closest to the stove when they sat together in the evenings. Emmett accepted this attention with the distracted tolerance of a boy who does not quite understand why everyone is being especially kind to him, but is not inclined to question it. On the 3rd of January, 1874, the afternoon light had a quality to it that she had not seen before. A stillness, a kind of held breath in the atmosphere that made the valley feel simultaneously very large and very close. The animals in Weston Greer's barn, half a mile downstream, were making sounds she could hear from her own doorway when the wind dropped. The temperature at midday was 12 degrees above zero. By late afternoon, it was 4. Emmett had been feverish for 2 days, not severely, 101 in the mornings, dropping to normal by noon, climbing back by evening. Clara had been cooling him with damp cloths and keeping him close to the stove and watching the color in his face and the sound of his breathing with the particular vigilance that has no name, but that every parent of a sick child in a remote place understands entirely. She stood in her doorway in the late afternoon and looked at the northern sky. The color was wrong, not storm wrong in the ordinary sense. This was a blue so deep it was almost steel, almost the color of something metallic, something cold at a molecular level, the color of a sky that had had all its warmth removed by some process operating at a scale beyond weather. She had never seen that color before. She did not need to have seen it before. She went inside. She fed the stove until it was as full as it would safely hold. She brought every piece of firewood she could carry from the corridor into the main room and stacked it against the interior wall. She checked the chinking on the north face of the cabin, pressing moss and clay into the gaps she had not gotten to in November. She filled every vessel in the cabin with water from the creek before the cold could freeze the source. She checked Emmett's temperature, 102.5. She sat beside him and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and listened. At dusk, the wind began. Within an hour, visibility was zero. The wind did not build gradually. It arrived. One moment, the air outside was moving with the purposeful violence of a serious storm, and the next moment, it was something else entirely, a sustained, pressurized roar that made the cabin walls vibrate at a frequency Clara could feel in her back teeth. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in 20 minutes. She knew this because she had hung a thermometer on the interior wall near the north-facing window, and she checked it every hour with the methodical regularity of someone who has decided that information, however unwelcome, is always preferable to ignorance. 8 degrees below zero at midnight, 14 below by 2 in the morning, 22 below by the time the sky began its pale, reluctant lightning toward what passed for dawn. The stove worked. That was the central fact around which everything else organized itself. The stove worked, and the wood was 3 feet from the door, and Emmett was not getting worse. He was not getting better either. His temperature had climbed to 103 by midnight and stayed there hovering with the stubborn persistence of a fever that has decided it has somewhere to be and is not yet ready to leave. His breathing was audible in a way that Clara did not like, not the wet rattle that Doc Elmore had warned against. Specifically, not yet that, but a texture to each breath that suggested the lungs were working harder than they should. She kept the damp cloth on his forehead and changed it every 20 minutes and kept the cabin at 72 degrees and did not allow herself to think past the next 4 hours. 4 hours was the interval she had set for stove feeding. She built her night around it like a structure, 1 feed to the next, each interval, a small unit of survival completed and banked. At 1 in the morning, she opened the corridor door. The cold that pressed against the opening was extraordinary. Not wind, because the corridor blocked wind from all 4 sides, but a dry, absolute cold that had weight and presence, the cold of an atmosphere that has surrendered its last residual warmth. She could feel it on her face and the backs of her hands immediately, the kind of cold that communicates its seriousness without ambiguity. She stepped 3 feet into the corridor. The firewood stood in its stacked courses exactly as she had placed it, protected by the roof above, sheltered from the driven snow by the structure, on all sides elevated off the ground on its lattice of poles. She lifted 3 split logs. They were dry. They were cold to the touch in the way that very dry seasoned wood is cold, not damp, not heavy, not resistant, just cold. The cold of a thing that has given up its moisture and kept its density. She stepped back inside. She closed the corridor door. She fed the stove. 30 seconds. She had not lost sight of Emmett. She had not lost the warmth of the room in any meaningful way. She sat back down beside her son. She thought about Jacob Norris. Norris had been 63 years old, had homesteaded in the valley for 11 years, had survived every winter the territory had thrown at him through a combination of experience and stubbornness that the valley respected. His woodshed was 40 feet from his cabin door, which was how woodsheds were built, which was the correct distance according to Reverend Cord, according to Harriet Voss, according to every settled homesteader in the valley who had done it that way without questioning it because it had always been done that way. Norris had gone out to his woodshed on the first night of the blizzard. He had made the 40-foot walk in conditions that reduced visibility to the length of your arm. He had loaded his arms with wood. On the way back, the wind shifted, or he turned the wrong direction, or the whiteout simply took the world away from him, the way whiteouts do without warning and without mercy, and he had lost the line between the shed and the cabin in 20 feet of open ground. They found him the morning the storm broke. He was 4 feet from his own front door. Clara did not know the details yet. She would not hear them until Briggs came on the 10th. But she had read the territorial papers accounting of the previous winter's deaths, and she understood the general shape of the risk. 17 lives lost in the Helena area, most of them in transit between structures during storms. She had built her system specifically to eliminate that transit, to collapse the distance between fuel and fire to something that could be managed without exposure, without navigation, without the particular danger of a human being operating in conditions that exceed what human beings were designed to operate in. At 3 in the morning, feeding the stove for the fourth time since midnight, Clara Merritt understood something she had not let herself think about directly since June. She had won, not the storm. You did not win against the storm. The storm would do what it did regardless of what she thought about it. What she had won was something more specific and more durable. She had built a system that worked when she needed it to work under the exact conditions she had designed it for, and it was working now at 3 in the morning at 22 degrees below zero, with a sick child asleep 6 feet from the stove and the wind taking the world apart outside. She was not lucky. She had looked at a problem, understood its structure, designed a solution, built it with her own hands over the course of a Montana summer, while her neighbors laughed, and now the solution was functioning with the quiet reliability of something built correctly for a specific purpose. There was no one to tell this to at 3 in the morning. Nora and Jasper were asleep. Emmett's breathing was steadier than it had been at midnight. Not well, not recovered, but steadier. The fire ticked in the stove. The wind moved over the roof and around the corridor structure and could not find a way in. Clara sat in the firelight and let herself feel for exactly 1 minute the specific satisfaction of having been right about something that mattered. Then she checked Emmett's temperature, adjusted the damp cloth, and went back to watching. The storm lasted 4 days. 43 inches of snow fell across the prickly Pear Valley between the 3rd and 7th of January, 1874. Temperatures did not climb above zero for the duration. On the second day, the kerosene in Clara's lamp thickened and had to be warmed by the stove before it would flow. On the third day, the creek froze solid enough to walk on, which she knew because she could hear the ice working in the silences between wind gusts, a deep ticking and groaning that carried through the cold air with unusual clarity. She burned through half a cord over the 4 days feeding the stove, every hour during Emmett's worst hours and every 4 hours when he seemed stable. The cabin held at 72 degrees throughout. She slept in 2-hour increments when Emmett's temperature allowed it in her clothes in the chair beside his bed, waking to the stove's diminishing heat the way a sailor wakes to a changing wind. On the morning of the third day, Emmett's fever broke. It did not break dramatically. His temperature simply began to decline: 102, then 101, then 99.5 by evening. His breathing cleared. He asked for water, then for food, then complained that the blankets were too heavy, which was the first complaint he had made in 3 days, and which Clara received as the most welcome sentence she had heard since arriving in Montana territory. She fed him broth. She let him complain about the blankets. She went to the corridor and stood in the cold for a moment alone, looking at the stacked wood, still 3 cords remaining dry and ordered in exactly where she had put it. And she pressed her hand flat against a split log and felt its solidity and its dryness, and stood there for a while in the cold, doing something that occupied a similar space to prayer, though she would not have called it that. The storm broke on the 7th. The wind stopped first between 3 and 4 in the morning, with the abruptness of something mechanical switching off. The sky began to lighten, and by mid-morning it was the particular blue of a post-storm winter day, absolute and cold, and scoured clean of everything that was not light. The valley had transformed. Drifts had built against the south faces of every structure, some of them reaching the eaves of traditional cabins. The road to Unionville was indistinguishable from the fields on either side of it. 3 families in the valley, she would later learn, had come close to exhausting their wood supplies in the final 2 days of the storm, unable to reach their outdoor wood piles through drifts that had buried them completely. Clara's quarter was clear. The roof had shed snow continuously as it fell, and what had accumulated around the base of the structure had drifted away from the open sides rather than into them. She walked into the corridor on the morning of the 7th, and it was exactly as she had left it, dry ordered, accessible, the wood standing in its courses as if the past 4 days had been ordinary days in an ordinary week. She stood there for a moment in the cold morning light and thought about all the things she had been told over the preceding 8 months, about proper sheds and proven wisdom, and the distance wood piles ought to keep from dwelling structures, about women alone and children at risk, and the particular arrogance of thinking you could improve on 30 years of accumulated frontier practice, about the shed that ate the cabin and the widow who was going to get her children killed. She picked up 3 logs for the morning feed and went inside to make breakfast. Old Man Briggs arrived on the 10th of January breaking trail on snowshoes through drifts that reached his waist in the low areas. He was checking homesteads in sequence, moving from one to the next, with the methodical efficiency of a man who understands that the time between a storm's end and a rescue's arrival is finite and should not be wasted. He had found Jacob Norris 2 days earlier on the morning the storm broke. Norris had gone out to his woodshed on the first night of the blizzard and had not made it back. 40 feet of open ground and a whiteout at 22 below zero. Briggs had stood in the snow outside Norris's cabin for a long time before going inside, looking at that distance, thinking about what it meant. He stopped on the trail above Clara's homestead and stood looking at her structure before he came down. The quarter roof line was clean and unburied. The stacked wood inside was visible and dry. A straight column of smoke rose from the chimney. He came down and knocked. Clara opened the door. Behind her, Emmett sat at the table, wrapped in a blanket, eating from a bowl, with the focused attention of a child who has been sick and is now very interested in food. Nora was washing dishes. Jasper was asleep near the stove. Briggs looked at the inside of the cabin. Then he looked at Clara. "How much wood did you burn during the storm?" he said. "Half a cord over 4 days," Clara said. "I kept the cabin at 72 degrees the whole time because Emmett was sick." Briggs was quiet. He looked at Emmett, who looked back at him with the mild curiosity of a boy who has met this man before and found him interesting in the manner of old things that have been outside in all weathers. "Half a cord in 4 days is expensive burning," Briggs said. Jacob Norris froze to death 4 feet from his own front door. Clara said, "I heard it from the Garrett boy who came through yesterday. Norris had 20 years in this valley in a woodshed 40 feet from his cabin and experience enough for any 3 men." She paused. How much would he have paid for a system that kept his firewood within arm's reach? The name sat in the silence between them. Briggs took his hat off. He held it in both hands in front of him. "I was wrong about this," he said. The words came out evenly without visible difficulty, which suggested he had been composing them for several days. "I told you a woman alone couldn't manage, and I told you this design was foolishness, and I told you to do it the way it's always been done. I've been doing it the way it's always been done for 26 years, and it works well enough until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, the cost is what happened to Norris." He looked at the quarter. "This is smarter than what I know. I don't enjoy saying that. But out here, true matters more than comfortable." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Come in and get warm before you go on to the next place," she said. He came in. He sat by the stove. Emmett told him about the storm with the narrative enthusiasm of a boy describing an adventure, and Briggs listened with the full attention of a man who understood that a child this age talking this freely about a blizzard he had just survived was the best possible sign. The news traveled the way all news traveled in the valley, from one homestead to the next, carried by whoever was moving, accumulating detail and commentary as it went. By the end of January, every family within 10 miles knew what had happened at the Merritt homestead during the blizzard. The corridor had stayed clear. The wood had stayed dry. A sick child had stayed warm. The widow, who had been the subject of 8 months of careful skepticism, had come through the worst storm in recent memory without losing so much as a piece of frozen firewood. Three families who had nearly exhausted their supplies during the storm came to look at the structure in February when the roads opened enough to permit travel. They walked through the corridor and examined the post spacing and the rafter angles and the roof joinery. They asked practical questions, and Clara Squire answered every one. She showed them the elevated ground lattice, the gap stacking method, the corner post bracing she had added after a heavy rain in August, tested the structure's lateral stability. Weston Greer came to confirm final details he had begun recording in November. He walked the corridor with the focused efficiency of a man who has already decided what he is going to build. He stood at the entrance and studied the junction between the corridor roof and the cabin roof for a long time, working something out silently. Spring, he said, which Clara understood to mean that he would build his version when the ground thawed enough to set posts. Reverend Cord came in March. He examined the structure with the careful attention of a man reassessing a position he had held with some force. He said he believed the Lord occasionally worked through unconventional instruments, and that the design represented a kind of practical wisdom that deserved respect alongside traditional methods. It was the closest thing to an apology that his particular form of integrity would permit, and Clara accepted it in the spirit it was offered. Harriet Voss rode out from Unionville in early April. She walked around the structure, looked at the 2 cords of wood still remaining after the winter, and did the arithmetic. You could patent this design, she said, charge licensing fees across the territory. Anyone who wants to build one is welcome to copy it, Clara said. I'll answer questions if they ask. Harriet studied her. You could make real money from this. The frontier is hard enough, Clara said, without people paying to protect knowledge that could keep families alive. By the summer of 1874, 7 families in the valley had broken ground on variations of the design. Some extended the roof on 2 sides rather than 4. Others built freestanding versions that applied the same principles: elevation coverage, air circulation, proximity, without integrating them into the cabin roofline. Weston Greer built his version in June, working with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did, and when it was finished, it was structurally sound and practically identical to Clara's in every measurement that mattered. Doc Elmore spent the winter of 1874 to 1875 tracking outcomes across the valley. He documented what he found with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 30 years recording evidence. Families using covered integrated wood storage systems experienced 32% fewer cold-related respiratory illnesses compared to families using traditional outdoor woodpile methods. The difference was attributable to more consistent cabin temperatures and reduced exposure during fuel gatherings. He sent his findings to the territorial newspaper, which published them in the spring of 1875, and the letter generated more correspondence than he had expected. Similar designs began appearing in homesteads from Bozeman to Missoula. By 1876, most of them independently developed, but all of them expressing the same underlying logic that Clara had worked out on a piece of bark with a charcoal stick in the summer of 1873. Weston Greer proposed marriage in the spring of 1875. He did it without ceremony, standing in his own completed corridor with sawdust on his coat. Clara asked for 3 days to consider, which he accepted without question. She spent those days thinking not about whether she wanted to marry him, but about whether the life they would build together was one she could enter with full honesty about who she was and what she required. On the 3rd day, she told him yes. They were married in June by Reverend Cord in Unionville in front of 31 people, most of whom had been standing in the valley when she arrived with $47 and a land claim, and an idea that had not yet proven itself. Old Man Briggs died in the winter of 1877. He was found in his cabin in late February, the stove cold, the temperature inside not far above the temperature outside, which was 30 below. He had fallen asleep and the fire had gone out while he slept, and he had not woken to tend it. 29 Montana winters, and the danger had not been the storm or any of the dramatic forms that death took in that country. It had been a man too tired to wake, in a woodshed at the traditional distance, in a fire that needed feeding and no system to bridge that gap when the man himself could not. The valley mourned him properly. He had been difficult and correct about most things and wrong about a few important ones, and that combination deserved the full weight of a genuine goodbye. By 1880, it was difficult to find a homestead in the prickly pear valley that did not incorporate some version of covered integrated wood storage. The specific forms varied, but the underlying logic was everywhere. Keep the wood dry, keep it close, eliminate the exposure gap between fuel and fire. Nobody by 1880 remembered where the idea had come from. It had become one of those things that Valley people simply knew to do, absorb into practice so completely that newcomers assumed it was simply the way things had always been done in this particular piece of Montana territory. Clara Greer lived until 1923. She died in May at 81 years old in the same valley where she had arrived 50 years earlier as a 31-year-old widow with $47 and three children, in the beginnings of an idea about roof lines and moisture and the physics of heat. Her obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned her work with the local school board and her membership in the First Methodist Church. It mentioned Weston, who had preceded her by 6 years, and her children Nora, who had married and moved to Billings, Emmett, who farmed the original Merritt claim, Jasper, who had gone east for school and stayed. It did not mention the corridor. It did not mention the 7 families who had built their own versions in the summer of 1874, or the design that had traveled from the prickly pear valley to homesteads across 3 territories in the years that followed. The design had become invisible through success. It had worked so reliably for so many families over so many winters that it had passed through the stage of being a good idea and arrived at the stage of being obvious. And obvious things do not require origins because they have always, as far as anyone currently living can remember, simply been true. There are structures in that valley today, the ones built well enough to outlast the people who built them, and some of them still show the extended roof lines, the covered perimeter corridors, the post and beam frames that wrap the original cabin the way a larger frame wraps a smaller one. The wood is long gone. The people are long gone. But the shape of the solution remains in the shape of the structure. And if you know what you are looking at, you can read in it the logic of a woman who looked at a problem in 1873 and saw not the problem everyone else saw, but the one underneath it. The shed that ate the cabin kept 3 children alive through a Montana blizzard because one woman understood that survival does not reward tradition. It rewards correct thinking applied before the storm arrives, built into the structure of things so thoroughly that when the temperature drops to 31 below and a sick child is burning with fever 6 feet from the stove, the answer is not courage or strength or endurance alone. It is 3 steps to the corridor door, dry wood within arm's reach, 30 seconds and back inside, and the fire never going out. That is what Clara Merritt built in the summer of 1873 while her neighbors laughed. Good ideas do not require recognition to be valuable. They require only that someone builds them before the storm arrives. Clara built hers in time. And 50 years later, in a valley full of structures that were her solution without knowing her name, the proof of that was still standing in the shape of every extended roofline that kept the firewood dry and the families inside warm through the long Montana winters, that did not negotiate and did not wait and did not care at all what anyone had planned to do differently next year.